right. Hi, everyone. So I am delighted to be moderating this next panel, Market Mechanisms for Climate and Resource Sustainability. So markets are often described as, non-governmental approaches, and sometimes they're appealing precisely because they seem to operate outside of the government. They're framed as flexible, decentralized, cost-effective, and responsive to incentives in the system rather than coming down from above in some way. But they don't exist in a vacuum. And in fact, a lot of these paradigm shifts that we are talking about can have a profound effect on whether markets exist at all, how they're structured, how they function, who participates in them, property rules, liability rules, disclosure requirements, subsidy structures. All of these shape supply and demand in ways that are not neutral. And ultimately, markets depend on people, on public preferences, on trust, on information that they can have access to. So we've gathered a terrific group of experts here to consider very different contexts in which market-based approaches are operating or evolving. So including water markets, payment for ecosystem services, and corporate sustainability practices. So our experts will reflect not only on how these mechanisms function in practice, but also on their limits, their future, and especially in this kind of polarizing and institutionally shifting environment. So their full biographies are in the program, so I'm going to keep my introductions brief as I call them up. So I am very pleased to welcome Vanessa Casado Pérez. Vanessa is Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and Professor of Law and Research Professor of Agricultural Economics at Texas A&M University School of Law. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thank you, Caroline. So, do I need a mic up here?
Yes.
No, I can have mine. So you need to. Okay. So I wanted to start, like every presenter, by thanking Sarah, Rob, and Caroline for putting this together. I have learned a ton, both from presenters and from the questions of the audience, and I am sure I will continue learning for the rest of the day. I'm going to present about water markets, and this is a topic that is less subject to political winds than the presentations that have come before. It has this advantage that doesn't lead to such striking pictures that we have seen in PowerPoint presentations before. If I tell you that we are in a scarcity crisis in the United States, it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone in this room. I put the two pictures because they are exactly depicting the same, but the choice of colors makes one much more alarming than the other. Mostly the US West and Southwest, but the problems with the scarcity, as you can see, are now reaching the Southeast too, make us have to come with solutions and make us think carefully about innovations like we have been thinking today about how to respond to the current crisis. It's true that the US West has always been in a situation of drought and scarcity, but now the problem is structural. California is thinking about a future of 10% less water supply, but they are not thinking 10% less in 200 years. They are thinking 10% less by 2040. And part of the problem is that we are responding, or the toolkit that we have is old, right? Prior appropriation was envisioned in the 19th century in mining camps and responds to the first-in-time, first-in-right principle, which means that it's biased towards the status quo and prioritizes senior water rights. And the issue is that we cannot solve the problem of the West without some sort of relocation. Where that relocation is coming from, we will see as the situation gets dire. Right? There are talks about the Colorado River, and everyone seems to build a consensus around that we will not solve the problems of the Colorado River Basin unless we retire the part of the agricultural use. But there is one tool in prior appropriation that can help, at least a little, and those are water markets. Right? The idea is that water market can help, at least at the margins, in increasing the flexibility that the prior appropriation system have. Are they going to be the main method of allocation? No. Even the most active water markets today in Texas, Arizona, or California don't transfer more than 4% of the water used in the state. but they certainly contribute to making the effects of scarcity and effects of droughts a little bit less costly. When we talk about water markets, and Caroline was mentioning this, people have very strong feelings. There is a group of people that will oppose the commodification of water, and they will just say water, the Constitution says, is a public resource, and as such, we should not allow it to be transferred. Or that they will say, well, water is given for free, so why would we allow those that hold water rights to profit from them? On the other side of the spectrum, we have free market environmentalists that say, well, if water is so precious, why we don't let the market allocate it? It will finally fix a price and we will use it efficiently. And this is a helpful discussion. I do think that water markets are not free markets. Water markets are heavily regulated enterprises, and that we can regulate them in a way that some of the concerns of the first group are addressed, and that they have a role to play because we are in such a situation that we need every single tool that we have in the toolkit. So what do water markets do? Prior appropriation doesn't have a real way of encouraging efficiency. And water markets can encourage efficiency in the agricultural sector or in any other sector, but a lot of the transfers come from agriculture. Why? Because, well, if I pay very little for my water, and I will mention some of the other barriers, I don't have an incentive of using it particularly efficiently. But if suddenly I can sell water that I save, I have to decide, do I continue growing this crop or do I not? Do I continue using flood irrigation or do I invest in drip irrigation and sell the surplus? So water markets are not a single thing, and I decided to include this list because one of the themes I would say of this conference is that there are opportunities to innovate in all these areas of environmental law, and that has been the case also in water. So we have short-term leases, right, that are up to 1 year. They allow you to respond quickly to a drought situation. We have permanent transfers between maybe the agricultural sector and a city, or farmers that are growing annual crops and farmers that have nut crops that need to make sure that they have permanent water because otherwise they will lose their investment. But we also have had one innovation that has been in stream flow transactions. Prior appropriation didn't contemplate the possibility of having in-stream flow rights. And states have increasingly recognized the possibility of non-consumptive water rights. And that has allowed for, ensuring that there is some water left in the river. Our concern for environmental flows came too late. We had already allocated most of the water in our rivers. Command and control could be used in order to ensure in-stream flows, but it's certainly an uphill problem. So in-stream flow transactions can help them. There are also water banks. Water banks are, once again, a proof of my statement before that water markets are not necessarily free markets. Water banks, like the Idaho Water Bank, is situations where the state is the buyer and seller. In that way, transactions are standardized, search costs are reduced, so transaction costs go down, and transfers can go up. One of the most celebrated water banks started in 1991 in California with one of the worst droughts that California suffered. There are also, and you can include it within the huge umbrella of market mechanisms, groundwater conservation easements. Right? There has been good success in the land conservation movement with land conservation easements, and now some states allow them also for water, and the idea is that farmers get paid in order not to use the groundwater. That obviously only works if you have a regulatory framework that makes that possible, both recognizing the possibility of conservation easements in water and ensuring that groundwater is not subject to the rule of capture and that water rights are quantified. Have water markets work? Somewhat. Could they have worked better? Everyone will tell you that absolutely. Why? What are the barriers to water markets? One is the nature of water itself, right? Water is very hard to transport. We have heard time and time again that at some point they will take water from the Great Lakes and take it to the Southwest, or from British Columbia in a pipeline to California. But that's hardly, that will be very expensive, and it has not happened yet. I no longer say that it will never happen because the last year or so has shown me that I should not have expectations about how things work. So with that said, so water markets are not, national. They tend to be basic. Then there are also legal barriers built into the system. One was the idea that only certain uses were beneficial uses, and that didn't include environmental uses. But somehow we overcome that challenge. We still have a use it or lose it doctrine that implies that if you stop using your water right, you may lose it. That was also a barrier for in stream flow transactions, but it was also a psychological barrier for participation in water markets. Many users were reluctant to participate because they had fear that if they send a message to the agency that, hey, I'm selling my water or my surplus water, the agency will say you never needed that water. And it took in several states several iterations of legislation just stating we will not come after you if you participate to actually increase the amount of transactions. We also have very, very poor data. I always say that there is no company that can manage their uncertain assets when they also don't know their liabilities. But in water, we have come up with lots of water plans and so on, but we have very poor data about who has a right to what. Some states have gone through adjudication process to decide who has a right to what that have lasted more than 30 years and cost millions, but we still don't have like a complete water registry that will facilitate those transfers. Colorado is probably, if anyone is interested, the one that has better data. And finally, we have the no injury rule. Water use is interdependent, right? If I use my water, I will return some of it, it will go down the river, someone else will use it. So as soon as we introduce any transfer there, the balance is off. And we have to make sure that that transfer doesn't injure third parties, the environment, and sometimes the public interest. So anytime someone enters into a water transaction, this is slightly overgeneralization, but for the purpose of the talk, it would work. You have to go through a process of review that includes lawyers, hydrologists, and it's very, very expensive. Hahnemann and Womble had a study about transaction costs in Colorado, and they showed that sometimes transaction costs are so high that the transaction no longer makes sense. So there are different proposals about how to make water markets more streamlined that will ensure that more transactions can happen while preserving this idea that third parties will not be harmed. But there has been a recent development that has cast a shadow, let's say, to water, or on top of water markets. And it's the investment from Wall Street in water. And if you watch the movie The Big Short, at the very end, Michael Burry says, hey, I'm gonna move to water. And he actually did. What I am not talking about, though, is the trading in water futures in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. That's a bet on the price of water, and the index is based on certain water markets in California, but that's not trading any water. Right? That's bets on the price. We can talk more about it. Maybe there could be manipulation on the ground. But what I am really interested in is Wall Street buying water rights, because that had not happened before. And just to give you two examples, Water Asset Management started to buy tons of water rights in the Grand Canal Association west of Junction in Colorado, to the point that they were one of the main right holders in that area. Grand Columbia, in the span of a couple of months, spent millions and became one of the main water right holders in Washington State. And some of the firewalls that we have built in our water rights system work to at least reduce the potential risk of those transactions. Right? What is Wall Street doing? Conceiving water as an investment asset. And that's not the ethos of private appropriation that wants us to consider water a production input. And because we have the use it and lose it doctrine that has lots of problems, in this case it has obligated Wall Street to actually lease back the water to farmers. Their long-term plan, it's more complicated than that, but at least that's what they are doing now, and water is being used. On the other hand, Gran Colombia decided to game the system and go through an approval process in order to allow them to sell water anywhere in the basin, and had a blanket approval. And the Department of Ecology said, the no injury rule doesn't allow us to do that. So some of the built-in protections have worked. However, there are still concerns. Now, there is some data in Washington State that when brokers and financial companies are involved, the prices tend to be inflated. There are concerns, similarly, that the work that Jessica Shoemaker has made in absentee land ownership in water, right? These companies will control it. They are very far away from the community. There are power imbalances, both at the local level and at the governmental level. What do I mean by that? These are very big owners now. In some of these irrigation communities, they may have, the majority of voting rights, and they may change the rules of the game. States are fearful of them, because if Colorado, and who knows if we will ever solve the problem of the basin, and we will know what obligations each state has, but if Colorado needs to fulfill their obligations and they need to rely on a buyback program from the agricultural sector, they will be at the mercy of the prices that these companies will set. And there is also the issue that they have, they are more sophisticated actors. And one way that sophistication shows is that they have lots of data about the market that less sophisticated actors don't have access to. Because we don't have, even though these transactions have to be reviewed by whatever agency or court it's in charge of, we don't have a good data about how the market is working. The only source is whatever a private company called Westwater Research and similar situated companies have put together. So what should be done? And I'm going to travel to Australia in 2 seconds. Australia changed their water rights system. They unbundled water rights. They made markets the signpost of their water management. And when I moved to the United States 18 years ago, everyone was enamored about what Australia had done. That love story is, it's not in such a strong position now, because reviews by the Australian government have shown that the participation of financial companies and brokers and the like has led to some power imbalances and also some unsavory conducts on part of these companies. So at least we should regulate water markets like we do financial markets, right? So insider trading should be banned. There should be public provision of information. That's the 2 main lessons that come from Australia. Could we do more? Perhaps. If we want to do more, then we will have to become very creative, and I am not sure that the property rules will allow us to do that. But one potential solution would be, and I think this is what really is bothering us from these companies, is that they are very large, right? And the amount of control they will have over such a precious resource, that we need to limit it. And one way is what we did on fisheries, which is limit the amount of water rights that someone can hold, or maybe create tiered water rights, like for small farmers, for medium-sized farmers, and for large farmers. But this will not only affect the Wall Streets of the world, they will also affect Bill Gates buying farms in the Columbia River Basin, Harvard Endowment investing in wineries in California because they won the groundwater rights, and so on. And I want to end by saying there have been some proposals at the state level, and if someone wants to discuss them on how to address this, I will. None of them pan out, so I don't know if they will in the future. And I just want to end by, as you can see, there have been innovation in water markets. So there can be innovations in any area of environmental law that you are interested. And that's what gives us hope, and I think that's the other theme of this conference. We know that you all care a lot, and you will come up with solutions that, the main scholar of environmental law, the Lorax, tells you that things are gonna get better.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, and I'm excited to hear what kind of questions that provokes in everyone here. By the way, there's some seats still in the front, because I see some students in the back standing. I welcome you to come down. Next, we're going to hear from Jim Salzman, the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor at UCLA School of Law and the School of the Environment, UC Santa Barbara, which is a beautiful location. I remember when you invited me there. And I welcome you now to DC to return the favor. What I love about this panel is we're really moving into different contexts. You just heard about water markets. We're going to move into a completely different context. We're going to hear about ecosystem, payments for ecosystem services. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you. I should just note I keep a paddleboard in my office because across the road there's a surfing beach. So I'm going to start, that's a true story. I'm going to start with another true story as well. I always like to start with stories. So the real sort of creator of the field of ecological economics, Dr. Daly, he was a professor at the University of Maryland for a long time. In the 1990s, the World Bank decided they needed to be greener, more sustainable, and so they brought on Herman as a special advisor. He was supposed to review these reports as they came up, and so he told me this story, so I know it's true. So he got a report from the economist of the bank, and it had this graphic. And it said the natural economy is contained within the human economy. And Herman, who was a minister as well, very gentle, sweet man, said, not exactly. It's actually the reverse. Because without natural capital, without the natural economy, without ecosystem services, we don't have the human economy. And they said, got it, thank you. So this is the next version. And Herman said, no, not exactly. Right? The human economy is contained within the natural economy. They're not separate, right? The human economy depends on the natural economy, and if you destroy the natural economy, you destroy the human economy. And this was the next version of the report. So this is explanation. And the next version of the report looked like this, right? And it basically was this, sort of does not compute sort of beach ball, kind of circulating beach ball that you see on your computer screen. And it gets at a much more fundamental challenge with law and policy in the environmental area, which is that natural capital, ecosystem services just are not considered in our environmental laws. So Gretchen Daly just came up with sort of a standard definition for ecosystem services. And it basically is the benefits that we get from the natural world. And so you might ask, what would life be like without ecosystem services? And I think the answer is, we wouldn't be around without ecosystem services. These are not sort of gentle benefits that we get. You can slice and dice ecosystem services into a lot of different categories. This is probably the best known for the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So let's just start with things we're familiar with. So climate regulation. If you don't have CO2 sucked up by vegetation, you've got a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere. Flood regulation, right? Wetlands operate as buffers on the coast. Wetlands operate inland. Water purification, we're going to talk about it a bit later. Nutrient cycling, unless you've got these sort of soil ecosystems, you're not going to circulate, you're not going to cycle the nutrients we need for growing things. There are a lot of different examples of this. But the fact is, and the problem is, that law doesn't incorporate this. It's a pretty basic problem. Right. From the economists in the room, these are positive externalities. They're not included. The terminology has changed. I started working in this area about 30 years ago. Ecosystem services was a term du jour. That's a little passé now, going French. So now we talk about nature-based solutions. We talk about green infrastructure, natural infrastructure. And this ties directly into what the Secretary of the Environment was talking about yesterday. All the examples she gave, these were nature-based solutions that she was talking about. So as I'll say, it's starting to enter into policy. But because these are law folks here, let me sort of talk about how to think about this from a legal frame and the challenge we face. So imagine that we have a sort of standard watershed, right? So the water falls as snow or as rain up in the top of the watershed. It makes its way down to the town, the village below, where they benefit from the water. The problem is that, and basically flowing through that watershed, it becomes cleaner. The problem is that we've got ranchers, farmers. One group of farmers cares a lot about water quality, so they put in these so-called riparian buffers. And so the manure that their cows are depositing in the lands, those actually are sucked up by the riparian vegetation. That's an ecosystem service, so it doesn't get into the streams. Then you've got the Homer Simpsons of the ranching world, and their cows basically are wandering in there. It's a real water quality problem downstream. And so they can build a treatment plant, which is expensive, or their engineers say, we actually could solve this problem just by putting riparian buffers for everyone, or a lot more riparian buffers. So you're the law and policy czar. What do you do? And whenever I teach, I use this mnemonic called the 5 Ps. And it turns out the environmental law toolkit just has 5 tools. And I force them to all start with P. And so one of them is prescriptive regulation. You can mandate that you put in riparian buffers. That was the question I had yesterday with the secretary. You can penalize them if they don't have them financially. Property rights is complicated in this context, what Vanessa was talking about, that kind of thing with the water markets. You can persuade them, a lot of pilot projects in the ag, or in the final, the 5th P, I'm sure you see coming, is you can pay them. Right? And the idea basically is, we have no problem paying farmers for potatoes, paying them for milk. Why don't we pay them for water quality? And that's sort of the question. So to what extent can we use payment as a policy tool when regulation, which might be from the government side, the obvious way to go is politically difficult, or you might think it's just not a good approach. And so to put this sort of in broader terms, imagine that you are a farmer, right, or a landholder, and you've got a lot of different things you're producing. Obviously, you're producing crops to sell, but you're also purifying the water in the area because of how you manage your lands. You're providing habitat for biodiversity, you're providing carbon sequestration. All of these provide value, but only one of them actually ends up with money in your pocket. And so don't be surprised if you focus on producing crops and you don't care at all about these other ecosystem services. And that's largely what we see. The challenge or the goal for working in the area of payments for ecosystem services is to change the income streams for all of this. You basically change the incentives of the landowners. And there are examples of this really all over the world. My favorite way of describing this is from a guy called Michael Jenkins. He runs a think tank called Forest Trends. And Michael asked, how do we make forests worth more standing than cut down? I just wanted to think about that for a second. It's a very deep question. How do you basically change the incentives so that forest owners actually do better or equally financially keeping their forests intact rather than cutting them down and selling the timber? It turns out there are a lot of different ways to do this. This is a bit of a daunting chart, but just if you look at it for just a quick second, I'm not sure if you can really read it back there, but essentially, the takeaway is threefold. There are a lot of different types of transactions of payments for ecosystem services. It's not a one-size-fits-all at all. It operates in different kinds of sectors. Water, biodiversity, carbon are the main ones. And then there are a lot of different ways that they are paid. Right? So it's a very complex system, and it's a rich system in that regard as well. About 10 years ago, I published an article in Nature Sustainability, where I basically, with colleagues, actually at Forest Trends, Michael's organization, this was the very first time in a peer-reviewed setting we collected all the information around the world on payment for ecosystem service programs. And what we found was that there were about $36 to $42 billion in transactions every year for PES, and about 550 programs. That was done 10 years ago. The number has increased since then. Is that a lot of money? Yes and no. Right? Tens of billions is a lot of money, but when you look at sort of the overall trade flows and such, it can get bigger. So how do we get it bigger, and what are the examples of what we're talking about here? So I'm just going to talk about a few of the common schemes. Government subsidies, right? So the government simply pays directly. And the biggest in the world is in China, called the Sloping Lands Program, Conservation Reserve Program in the US, you might be familiar with. Basically, farmers are paid to keep their lands fallow and to manage them a certain way. I wanted to keep this sort of current, so this is the most recent example I could think of, which happened last year in Costa Rica. There's concern about loss of mangroves along the coasts. And so basically the goal has been to work with mollusk gatherers, which I'm sure sounds better in Spanish. Basically there's annual payment to them. If they do their mollusk, they're basically, it looks like mussels to me, but basically they work in ways to basically maintain and protect the mangroves, which is where the mollusks grow. All right. The idea basically is we're paying you for the positive externalities you're providing, and we want to help with your livelihoods. mandatory beneficiary pays. This happens a lot. The best example is in New York City. I'm from Boston, so I have a sort of inherent antipathy to New Yorkers, which is earned, I think. But New Yorkers are always bragging, oh, we have the best pizza, we have the best theater, we have the best whatever. It makes me sick.
I'm from Brooklyn,
All right.
just want to remind you.
You know, I have it honestly. So they also say we have the best drinking water, which is true, but it's because it doesn't come from New York City. It comes from 120 miles away. And it's a long story I won't go into in detail, except to say that the way New York City gets its drinking water, which is excellent, is they have a payment for ecosystem services scheme to the communities up there to pay them to manage their lands in certain ways so the water quality is maintained. Much more recent, 2014, this is in Peru. Right? And the same system in Peru, where basically there's a bill that's put on your water tariff, same as in New York City, and 43 of the 50 water utilities in Peru do this now, where they basically transfer the money to upper watershed landowners to manage their lands in a way that maintains the quality. So this is the 10th anniversary, 2 years ago, that basically talked about all these things that were going on, right? And this is in Spanish, basically, paying back the ecosystem services. Mitigation, this is the last example that I want to give in terms of actually one more mechanism. This is an important one. So basically the market here is you're developing you're degrading some asset. It could be a wetland, it could be something else. And they say you can degrade this in exchange for credits for restoring somewhere else. You could destroy this wetland, but you're going to mitigate by creating this wetland somewhere else. So you can do it for species banking, you can do it for carbon offsets. The wetlands mitigation program in the US is the best example of this. There's also a big thing you may have heard about called carbon offsets. Anytime John Oliver spends 23 minutes dumping on your program is not good, right? And so carbon offsets have become a real target. And because of time, I'm not going to go into them now, except to say that I think they've been overly criticized. They have problems, but with any new market, you're going to get a lot of snake oil. And so what's been happening, actually he also had Oliver's offsets, just to make this as bad. And it says, the carbon offset credit, 1 certificate for a metric shit ton of carbon. Just to show how much he dislikes this approach. I signed a release, so I can say that. Okay, so what are we saying because of the concerns over the validity, the credibility of these carbon offsets? You're seeing private companies basically joining together and creating their own certification organizations and set up. So this is one you can see the companies below, and they've set up their own way to verify emissions credits. So not relying on some third-party verifier. California, you've also got the sort of the state aspect. They've got a compliance offset program. They allow carbon credits, right? Limited number right now, only in California. No foreign credits yet, but that could be coming. And again, that's its own topic we can talk about later. Last thing I want to talk about is the last administration got very interested in nature-based solutions. And they actually had a whole working group, a whole government working group on this, and they actually adopted a strategy to account for ecosystem services. I was talking about the first day about the importance of figuring out what are the benefits. And they basically set up a program to do this. It's obviously moribund right now, but things change, right? As we saw with the judicial decision that Sarah talked about a moment ago. And I think this will come back, right? It seems almost stupid not to account for the benefits that are provided by natural systems and what our actions are doing to those. And so let me end with sort of the question, how big can payments for ecosystem services get? And I think the best way to think about it is to think about Wall Street. So it builds well off the Wall Street photo we had a minute ago. So how does Wall Street make money, right? Apart from insider trading and corruption. So one way is to do a lot of the same deals at a small margin. That's the stock market and broker's fees, right? You can do the payments for ecosystem services if you have something you're trading that is fungible, like carbon credits. Right? But carbon credits you have to verify, and so it's expensive. So having a real commodity is difficult. Second way Wall Street makes money is they do very small number of transactions with big margins, right? That's investment banking. And that's closer to what payments for ecosystem services are, because those are fundamentally place-based. The problem is it's not clear there's a lot of money involved in that. And so, where we're left with is payments-free customer services are kind of in the middle of those. It's going to keep growing. It's an important mechanism. The reason I keep working at it is that it's so obvious, it's almost stupid. Then we have to account for ecosystem services. And the good news is, this is sort of a good news presentation, is that we're doing more of that. It's not a silver bullet, but it certainly gets us farther along the road to sustainability. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was terrific. And I do love the New York City Catskills example. I do teach it in my environmental law class. And just to kind of give you all a sense on that, it was cheaper, much cheaper, for New York City to pay folks upstate to make improvements to improve that water quality than it was to build a filtration plant. So this is about sort of bringing in those low-cost benefits to all solutions. I mean, we often think about those are not available, but sometimes they are. We're just not thinking broadly enough. And I am extremely thrilled. And actually, Vanessa, Jesse, are you seeing slides too?
No slides.
No slides, okay. Vanessa and Jim, I welcome you to join me up here then.
Yeah, I can sit back down.
No, you do what you want. So let me first.
I was just following the leaders there.
I am thrilled to introduce our final speaker, Jesse Glicksman, who is the Senior Corporate Counsel at Snowflake. But I want to say a little bit more because, Jesse, you've been sort of in this space for a while. You've been Corporate Counsel at Amazon and at Hewlett-Packard. And in all those roles, you've been working on sort of issues with global social environmental responsibility, looking at supply chain and legal issues throughout. So very happy that you're here with us, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, and really appreciate being here. Love coming to these environments where kind of folks from different spaces come together and talk. I always learn a lot, so those presentations already were great. Just want to say I'm speaking for myself, not for any of those companies. Make that just, I guess, specific. So the meta question that was asked to me was kind of what drives decisions or encourages sustainability within a company. And to address that, I feel like I need to set the table a bit. So I was trying to think of a theme, and the first thing I came up with was a roller coaster. And then I was sitting there last night, and I was thinking it's actually more like a roller coaster within a tornado, is how I think folks sitting in companies feel about this current moment. So my goal is a bit for this presentation for you to feel a bit of that whiplash and to kind of come out feeling a little dizzy. So if it feels a bit all over the place, I promise you it's going to come back together. But I think there's often a narrative about corporations from the outside, especially for folks who have never worked within a company, that there's a desire within a company to stop progress or not to address hard issues, specifically around ESG, specifically around climate. And I think it's much more complicated than that. I think it sits somewhere in the gray. There's certainly some companies that are bad actors. But my experience over the past 13 years basically practicing has been there's more of a tension. And I think that tension comes from a bunch of different factors, and I'm going to address those. The kind of sub-theme I want to get at is internal versus external. And actually that reference to the Leaf Coalition was like a perfect reference. And I'll maybe come back to that around some of the internal aspects, right? So there's two different buckets, I think, especially in this moment, you have to think about. And I also want to kind of name the stakeholders. I think there's kind of three primary stakeholders that companies think about. There's the consumers within like a business to consumer business, right? So anything that we buy, business to business, so enterprise businesses, right? So data center is a good example, right? Where your customers are other companies. And so there's a little bit of a difference there, but it will change how certain companies think about these issues. Investors, and then regulators. And so I think that I kind of want to take a minute first to travel through, and it traces a little bit from, so when I came out of law school in 2013, I went to Pace, came out, and I think ESG traces a little bit to that time period, so I'm going to use that as a framework. So when I came out of law school, it was really about CSR, right? It was very investor-driven, specifically private equity, right, around companies within that they were looking to acquire, trying to create governance and controls within those companies, right? And so that CSR, though, corporate social responsibility, at the same time, a lot of companies were starting to come out with kind of the glossy sustainability reports, right? And those reports, those teams were mostly like marketing and PR folks, right? Now, some of the stuff they were talking about for sure was valid, right? Like it was things that companies wanted to convey to customers and consumers that they were doing, right? And there was, because it was marketing and PR, there was no way to validate that, right? There was no framework for accountability. And so during that time frame as well, the Paris Agreement came about, right? A bigger focus around consumers, around climate accelerated choices they were making around purchasing practices. And so I think that was a moment where there was really no way for companies could basically say what they wanted with almost no accountability, with the exception of maybe consumer protection laws in California, right? If you made a claim, there were some ways you could bring suits for some accountability. Also at that time, voluntary disclosures were starting to come out. So the Climate Disclosure Project, which is now CDP, right, where some companies were voluntarily deciding to disclose about their practices, right, in a way to convey to their customers where they stood. And I think the big kind of time period was 2021-22, when the SEC published its climate rule, the EU announced the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and then the International Sustainability Board kind of started to push its voluntary standards, but different jurisdictions started to consider whether to adopt them or not. And I think this is important, in addition, I should say, to state regulators, right? We're considering regulation. I think this is important because it was a moment of, I think the first time companies really had to think about, wait, what am I publicly saying? What did my sales team say in that pitch? What's posted on the website for these thousands and thousands and thousands of products, right? Like what labels, what language are we using? Because suddenly there was a framework for accountability. Now with that accountability, on the other side, was just a big mess, right? That's the tornado. I mean, the EU and ISSB couldn't agree, so they went in essentially divergent directions. So those were not aligned, those regulations. The SEC rule was not aligned with the ISSB rule, IFRS rule. So it was a moment where leadership within companies who were already not super familiar with, these climate-related disclosures were thinking, what do we do with this? And so that was the spark of really building out governance and controls internally around ESG, right? Like, how do we make sure what we say is validated? And how do we address these disclosures? Now, some of the complexity, though, around that is that what you had already said publicly, right? You had to think about, do we walk this back, right? Or can we validate it? And anything you decided to say in the future, you have to specifically for US traded companies, think about, is that consistent with what we say in our 10K, right? Or is there an opportunity for shareholders to potentially bring a shareholder lawsuit because you're not being fully transparent? And so I think it both created a shift of intention for companies, so that I think the regulations worked as they were supposed to. However, it also had the effect of creating a lot of caution, right? Companies started to pull back from saying much of anything aside from what was being planned to be said within the disclosures, right? Because the question was, what does this mean and how will it be used? And I have to say, they weren't necessarily totally wrong, because then what happened? The SEC rule, right, gets withdrawn. All of the California climate rule is now in litigation. Obviously, New York just came out with a rule as well. We'll see what happens. But then even in the EU, and I think this gets to the panel that from before, because of all of the political turmoil, Ukraine, tariffs, the opening line of the delay of CSRD and the Corporate Due Diligence Directive, which focuses on human rights and environmental due diligence, that opening line referenced essentially like with tariffs in Ukraine, we can't do this right now, so we're delaying. And so they pulled the rug out, and what that did internally in a lot of companies was it validated some leadership's view of regulators, right? Like that they don't really understand what the actual cost is for companies, which I can tell you is really high. Like the amount of money at the companies that I've been at and resources that have been put into these efforts were not small. And now with that delay, what you have is a lot of the people who were working on those issues and a lot of the data collected, you're starting over, right? And those regulations now have to be rewritten. So, and then I'll just say also, it also lost trust with the actual stakeholders where investors and consumers and NGOs who wanted this data, especially in Europe, to understand what were companies doing around not just the environmental issues, but human rights as well. However, internally, and this is why I really want to split it, I think, you know, I'm a part of a group of practitioners, you know, at different companies who are doing similar work to myself, and I would say almost across the board, even if how these kind of governance structures, controls, and even the programs in place, right? And I think again, the Leaf Coalition is an interesting example. The work continues, right? And those controls are still in place, and those like if you formed an ESG governance committee, you're not just a company's not just suddenly saying, well, let's throw that out the window, right? It's kind of like I think about FCPA when that announcement came in the beginning of the Trump administration, like we're not going to really have enforcement around FCPA right now. No company said, okay, we're not going to worry about corruption. Like those are in place, and so that work moves forward. And so I think that there also continues to be, even if it has decreased a bit, there's consumer pressure, right? It has fallen a little bit from what I've seen in recent surveys on the list of what's important to consumers. However, in B2B, especially in like the tech space, Europe, right? Most of those companies are in scope of these regulations that are still going to come online. So if you're a US company, even if you're not in scope, right, you are going to have to provide data for your customer to comply in Europe, right? So there's a cascading effect. And so I think, you know, oversight, governance controls, all of the carbon accounting, I can tell you regardless of whether California regulations survive, and they have a climate risk regulation and a greenhouse gas regulation that requires publication of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Companies are definitely continuing to do that work because climate resiliency is critical to operations, and you need to know if it's going to affect your operation, hence your revenue. And on emissions, the work is already going on and the accounting has gotten to a place. There are so many, you know, consultants and it's not that hard to do necessarily. Scope 3 still presents challenges, significant challenges, but that work will likely continue to be done. Whether or not it's published publicly is another story, and I think that is kind of the big separation. And the last thing I'll say is that I think the voluntary reporting for sure continues. Like that was the interesting thing from my perspective. It felt like voluntary reporting was moving towards this mandatory regulatory reporting, and suddenly it's like going back to the future, like the CDPs, the EcoVadis, there's SBTI, which is Science-Based Target Initiative. Lots of companies have that publicly out there. Those have suddenly been written into contracts, right, with customers. They're like, oh, that was it. That was exactly where I wanted to stop. That was pretty good. Anyways, so I'm happy to answer questions, really happy to be here, and thanks for your time.
Jesse, I found it funny that you were a stricter moderator than I would have ever been. I would never have. And it's interesting how you ended on this sort of optimistic note, but I couldn't help but notice that sentence you put in there that it seems like consumer value of this has pulled back, But sort of on the fundamentals, companies still want to do this because it's happening and they need to think about these things. So that information, whether it's valued or not by the consumers on the product level, I mean, they want that information.
All I would say is I don't think it's actually any different from anyone in the room. Everybody's a human being who's operating in a company. Like, a company is made up of human beings. Consumers are human beings. And in this political climate, if you asked anyone in this room, what are your top 3 issues of concern, I'm not sure we would get over 50% that environment is number 1, right? Like, I care deeply about the environment. But we had some conversations last night at dinner. There are things going on right now that just trump concern. Well, I shouldn't have said. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. that trump concerns though, and so that's what I think it is. I think consumers still care about it, but if you ask them for a list, they likely have some, including affordability and other things like that. So.
Absolutely. So we have about 10-15 minutes to have audience questions, but I want to give our panelists an opportunity to either ask each other a question or and make any comments.
Jesse, my friend. So I actually, I'm not sure how well it's known. So before I went into teaching, I was the European environmental manager at SC Johnson Wax. So I basically came from the corporate sector. And the big issue was, obviously they want to measure things, but measurement costs, right? And so we spent a lot of time at Johnson Wax in the 90s figuring out which metrics we should focus on with the TCFD and the TNFD and all the other acronym, alphabet soup you were talking about. I guess I was curious your take on when there's not political pressure, which there isn't in the US right now, I think pretty clearly. How do the companies decide? Obviously you say that the work continues, but the work's expensive and they're always resource constrained. Yeah. And so what's the thinking about which kinds of metrics are we going to pay to get together, and also which of them are we going to publicize? Because what I've seen is a lot of companies may be doing the work but aren't talking about it.
Yeah. And so I would say it depends on the company, obviously, but I can say specifically, I will in this case, so being at Snowflake, which is a bit of a smaller company, we have clear pressure to, over there, and that was partly why I moved there, to provide, in contracts, to provide CDP to publish there, EcoVadis to publish there, right? And those are uniform questionnaires, right? And to have a science-based target. So those are completely voluntary, right? Other companies, I think, it's true of every company, I think, that you're primarily driven by, especially if you're a publicly traded company, by shareholder, value, creating value for your shareholders. That is what the law is in our country, whether kind of folks like it or not. And so that has to be a big consideration. And so I think the alphabet soup is mostly driven by customer demand and then actual regulatory requirements. I will say the amount of work that was done and put it in from government, from kind of the government affairs aspect, who I work closely with, to try to get a uniform standard globally, companies were kind of begging for it in a way. And it was really unfortunate that the EU and ISSB and US couldn't get together and say, hey, we're gonna have one standard. And so that just makes it really difficult, and it actually probably quadrupled the cost of compliance, right, which was significant. But it's hard, and I don't think there's one answer for every company.
All right, let's see some audience questions. Okay, I am often told I don't pause long enough to see hands, so I'm gonna wait. Okay, Chaki, I see your hand.
Do we have a microphone, or should I just talk? Okay, I can just.
We do have one, and Professor Glicksman's going to come over. Not a role he signed up for, but thank you.
Doesn't work. We have a microphone.
Projection.
Thank you for your comments. My question is, how does the CSDDD, when the final text comes out, how does that relate to current French and German due diligence laws? Is it seen as more of a complement, or is it a adding additional requirements from what you've seen so far?
That's definitely.
Yeah, no, I know, I just didn't want to jump in case it was, no, I mean, it's likely, it likely, I think, would replace it, in my opinion. I think eventually if it went, once and if it's transposed, and I should also say that if anyone in this room has not looked at like how European legislation works, it is just as much, if not more of a mess than the US, just to be clear, I learned that. And so how the directive is actually adopted by all the different member states, specifically France, my guess would be they're going to replace that with CS-DDD. I will also say though that because of this rewrite now, it's been watered down in the sense that now it's like 1.5 billion in revenue and 5,000 employees. So it's like 90% of companies that were in scope before they delayed it are no longer in scope. And so maybe France will change their mind and say, well, we still want all of our small companies within France to continue to report. But I'll believe it when I see it. The delays have just kept going, so I think now we're talking about like 2029 or 30, so to be determined.
Rob? Professor Glicksman.
I have a question about metrics, which Jim mentioned, and I want to direct it to him. So one of the three forms of payments for ecosystem services you talked about is banking systems. And I want to ask you a question about the efficacy of those systems. So the idea is if you're going to be allowed to destroy wetlands over here, you need to create wetlands over there that compensate. Are there any metrics or assessment mechanisms that gauge whether or not the newly created wetlands are serving the same natural functions as the ones that are destroyed? And are there any constraints to make sure that it's paying off?
Yeah, so basically the question was how confident can we be that mitigation banking really works? So to set this up, and this is important for Vanessa's presentation as well. So mitigation markets, water markets, as Vanessa said, they're entirely artificial. They're not markets. So if I'm selling Vanessa a bicycle, I care about quality because I want her to pay a certain amount. She cares about quality because she's paying for it. We both care about quality. In a mitigation market, if I'm a developer, I don't care about the quality of the mitigated wetlands. I just want a permit that allows me to go ahead and develop. If Vanessa is the wetlands banker, she's actually restored these wetlands. She actually doesn't care about the quality either. She just wants permission to sell credits to me. So unlike the bike, neither of us actually care about quality. The only person who cares about quality is the government regulator who's signing off on the bank. In the first 10 years of the mitigation banking program in the 90s, the Corps of Engineers didn't care about quality. And so it was called cosmetic landscaping. So you basically would take these old farms in East Yahoo, where the land is cheap, and they would put in these wetland plants, and they would live for a few years and then die because the soils were wrong, hydrology was wrong. So the metric they were using, and I'm simplifying, but the metric essentially was aquatic vegetation. Bad metric, bad result. They changed that in 2006 with new guidelines that focused more on function, more on ecosystem services. And it works better or not depending on where you are. So one of the great shocks I've learned in working in this field for a long time now is the Army Corps of Engineers is kind of not really like the Army in the sense that with the Army, when there's an order from on high, everyone follows it the same way. When an order comes on high from the head of the Army Corps of Engineers, if you're in Louisiana, the district in Louisiana, it's going to be very different than how it's implemented in California. And so essentially you've got the regulations that do have metrics that should capture function, but they are implemented very, very differently depending on where you are. And the problem that you're pointing out is that we know for sure we're going to destroy these wetlands, right? They're gone. How much confidence do we have that the mitigated wetlands are going to be better? The challenge is that politically we have to allow some kind of wetlands development, right? Politically it's just not going to stand. And so the mitigation was the sort of the political steam valve they came up with. But I'll stop after this, but George H.W. Bush, who kind of launched this whole thing, pledged no net loss of wetlands. What he didn't say was no net loss of what? And it's turned out to be no net loss of acreage instead of no net loss of function or ecosystem services.
Jim, do you know Will Raffi at UCLA Econ? Okay, yeah. So he has some work in Florida trying to get a number on how much actually gets, just at least one metric of what gets lost when you trade wetlands without thinking about the ecosystem services. And it's flood protection is a big one, and it's just one dimension. And so he thinks about how, from an economic perspective, you can kind of account for this through taxation. But it's something that is very important, absolutely. Questions?
Can I ask them a question? Oh no, go ahead. No, you go. I was gonna ask them, but.
Tali, why don't you go ahead?
I was gonna ask, just following up on the Army Corps of Engineers point, is there any consistency, like federally, to send people across those different programs to, no, it's
No.
I can't see who it is, but right there. Oh.
I am gonna call up my colleague Jim, so I'm gonna follow up on Rob's question. It's like, do you have good examples of the use for heterogeneous units like wetlands? Oh, sorry. Alright. For heterogeneous units like wetlands, for where the payments for ecosystem services really works well. I guess my concern is like Rob's. I mean, I certainly understand at the end of your talk you talked about this is. I don't think you say it's the second best, but this is not a silver bullet for everything. And certainly putting a price on ecosystem services is better than having no price at all. But obviously, a lot of concerns for many of us is that that there are so many prices that are not captured and will never be captured, including existence value, et cetera, that that's where the concern comes. I'm sure this is not a new question for you, but I thought I'd give you a chance to reflect on that.
Yeah, and also I can sort of convert that into the question for you too as well. I mean, essentially what Alex is asking is, are we living in the land of the second best, the third best, the fourth best? First best would be to regulate adequately. Politically, you can't do that in a lot of circumstances, and so you go to payments. I mean, the IRA is a perfect example of that in another setting. There are a lot of examples. I think the key thing to keep in mind when you talk about payments for ecosystem services, there are a lot of different kinds of schemes. Where most of the concerns are, I think, is with the mitigation with wetlands and with carbon. John Oliver doesn't talk about New York City's water, right? He's not because it works. And so, it sort of goes back to the point you were making, which is, can you get the metrics right? And then, as we've seen in practice, even if you get the metrics right, are you going to get the oversight and the enforcement that's going to make sure it happens? I keep working on this because we're not going to take the carbon example. We're not going to get the reductions we need purely through mitigation. We're just not. You have to have land-based sequestration, and offsets so far is the best way we know to actually do that. As there've been a lot of crap, that these sort of, I'm not going to say it again, but these terrible offsets go back and forth. Absolutely. But anytime you get a new market, if there's something of value, there's a lot of snake oil that's being sold as well. The question is the offsets market going to evolve to where it is credible? I see that happening, but other people think I'm a fool for saying that's happening. But the LEAF Coalition that we were talking about is an example of that, where the private sector steps in and says, okay, we know how to get things done. We're gonna take charge of it.
I guess I would just say that the irony, I don't think you're stupid. I just think the irony is that at the end of the day...
I said fool.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Sorry. But is whether at the end of the day, what makes it work or not, what hinges on is exactly what you said. The first best solution was not possible, which is to regulate. Whether the ecosystem service market works well or not, it sounds like you're saying, is how well the regulator works. So at the end of the day, it comes down to how good is the regulation.
It's going to depend. I would say something differently. If you look at the 5 Ps, the easiest from the regulator's perspective is to mandate you're going to put in riparian fencing, right? Boom. Politically, the ag lobby is strong. It's not a priority. That's not going to happen. What do we do next? And that's when you get this notion of payments for services. So, someone has to make sure that they're actually doing what they do, but that's contract law.
Alex? Alex to Alex, transfer. Thank you.
So my question's for Vanessa. You talked about that some of the limitations of more robust water markets is just sort of the lack of data and information, both about what water rights people actually have, but then I'm also guessing difficulty of knowing like who's using it, whether they have a right, and so just like not enough data to work with. And it's an interesting comparison to electricity markets where we have a lot of data on who's generating electricity, where it's going. We have really robust, wholesale electricity markets, even though that's a resource that is far less sort of tangible. So you'd think it would be more difficult. So are there things that water markets can borrow from electricity markets and regulators, or is it just that like there's just so much more opportunity for investment in those systems in the electricity area and not in the water area? So, like, how do you think about those?
So, I mean, there are problems of data at different levels. One, from the property rights perspective, we may not have a full account of who owns what. And as I said at the beginning, private appropriation is based on first-in time, first-in rights. It's important to know when does that water right establish, for how much, right, and where exactly it is physically located. So that's one set of data that we need to gather. And that, there have been pushes in different states where there have been adjudications in Colorado, in Idaho, and so on. So we are moving in the right direction. Are we there yet? No. But there is much more data. Plus, every single state now relies on a permit system. So you will have more information from rights that are junior. So that's one set. The other set that I was mentioning, and then I will address yours, is the idea that we don't have information about transactions. Even though they go through all this process, some companies have gathered that information, but if you go to the California State Water Resource Control Board and try to figure out all the changes that have been, it's almost impossible to gather really good data. The Bren School at some point had a good database, and then I think they stopped at some point.
The funding stopped.
Yeah. And then there is the middle, right? It's not only whether I have a right, but how much I am using. And that's a mess. And that in the sense that there are paper rights, people that have not been using, but the government has not gone after them in order to cancel those rights. We don't have that much measurement. Like water meters are not well established. We do have them at the urban level, but the agricultural sector is the huge chunk of water that we are using. So there is certainly, like if we want to have robust water markets, that's one area where we should invest. We do have models, and they are pretty good at, given the type of soil, the type of crop, the river, the type of diversion system that you have, that can approximate it without a meter. And they have been successful in the lower Colorado River Basin because they only allow for consumptive use to be transferred. They use those models, and that has been enough. But certainly we could learn more about measurement from the electricity market. Was something else I wanted to mention on this. And one example of success is the California Groundwater Management Act, right? Like now we have much more data since it was passed in 2014, and now the districts have been formed and they have come up with their plans. Measurement has been the main thing. And when it comes to groundwater, it's much easier than when you are in a river because you just need a meter on the pump.
Okay, terrific. I think we have time for one more question. Uma?
So this is for Vanessa, and it ties back to a question that you asked yesterday about sort of, okay, thanks.
Rob, Professor Glicksman asked yesterday a question about sort of what are the kinds of things that might change the perception of immediacy or near-term harms and impacts from climate change, and referenced kind of what many thought Hurricane Katrina would be one. You showed some maps showing dark red water scarcity in certain areas, and we've read in the headlines about towns that are on the brink of or already at the point of having no water. What can you share with us about how realistic people are being, how well calibrated
is the perception of water access across the most water-constrained areas of the United States?
I don't think we have abandoned the framework of responding to emergencies, and when we respond to emergencies, we not necessarily respond with a long-term plan. So, you know, like if Cape Town is running out of water, and they use the countdown because that also helped them implement some changes, or Mexico City is running out of water, that's very salient. And I am sure that prompts, but I'm not sure it prompts always structural reforms. However, sometimes it happens, right? Like I was in California when the SIGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, was passed in 2014. It were many years of drought. For many years, California, who normally is at the forefront of any type of environmental, water, anything, had done nothing to regulate groundwater, right? And that was the moment where there was enough support to come up with a system. It's true that the system somehow kicked the can down the road because they needed time to implement it, so it has not been until more than 10 years later that we actually see how that has worked. But that was a crisis, and from the crisis came a structural reform. So I am not sure what it will happen. Part of the issue, I think, is that as much as the ag lobby is very powerful, cities are also powerful, so you never let them run out of water. You may threaten them, but not run out of water, because that will make you lose the next election. So I see that we will have to retire farm water use in places like the Great Salt Lake. There is no way around it. In the Colorado River, if we have to figure out how to split it between the basins, and it will come with payments associated with it. But I am not sure it will come, any of these crises, with a reform of prior appropriation. But maybe.
All right, and with that, join me in thanking our panel today.